I think that science fiction writers are thankfully very bad at predicting the future. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But one is that the future changes based on what we do. And I'm a great believer that if we seize the means of computation, right, if we take control of our technological destiny, that we can make the internet back into the place it was that made us all so excited and wrest it back from this current kind of dystopian internet we have, which is just like 5 websites filled with screenshots from the other 4, where algorithms decide what you see and so on. And that if we can take control of the internet, we can take control of our lives, because the internet is such a useful tool for organizing everything else we do. It's not more important than climate change or economic justice or racial justice or gender justice, but it's the thing that we'll use to do something about those issues, and we have to take control of it.
Well, and knit the people together who maybe are able to do something about those issues.
Yeah.
The book is short stories, but they all seem knit together by a central premise, and some of it is just the fact that we are a little bit helpless against forces that we can't really control. And that was the perfect first story with a woman who is battling her own toaster. Thematically, when we're talking about radicalized, what is the point you're trying to make here?
Well, it is this idea of taking control of your technological destiny and doing so as a group. That, we've had 40 years of this doctrine that all of our problems are individual. And they're not, right? The reason we have climate change is not because of your personal recycling habits, right? And no matter how good your recycling habits are, we're not going to be able to solve climate change with them. We have big collective problems, systemic problems. And it's about people seizing their technological destiny to work together to address really big problems. So, Unauthorized Bread is a story about people in refugee housing whose appliances are these Internet of Things nightmares designed to milk every penny they have from them by forcing them to buy their bread from an authorized bread store and their groceries from an authorized grocery store, and the dishwasher only washes authorized dishes, and the washing machine will only wash authorized clothes. And the only thing worse than that is when the companies that start these businesses, who are the kind of, scumbag financial engineers who we see running the world these days, drive their businesses into bankruptcy. And so perforce these people have to take over their devices, jailbreak them, and they experience this brief moment of total technological mastery when they do this. And then it's taken away because the companies come back out of bankruptcy, and now they're facing felony prosecutions if they get caught because of a real law, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that makes it a felony to remove these locks from things that you own. And so, this is a story about like how high the stakes can become in a very short time. And, if you live in Seattle, you probably are or know some people who are very well-off techies and who are making decisions that redound to lots of other people's lives without necessarily much sense of what those lives are like. So, for example, Facebook has this real names policy. They require you to articulate your social graph. And, people are like, well, what's the worst that can happen? Well, the worst that can happen is militias in Egypt and Syria were stopping people, making them log into their Facebook accounts, figuring out who their friends were, and on that basis deciding whether or not to shoot them. Right? If those people aren't in the room when we're making technological decisions, our technological decisions could be very grim indeed.
Absolutely. And let's just talk a little bit more about the first story. It seemed to me almost in a very sort of, maybe in a very, not superficial way, but a very, very straightforward way, almost an allegory for this whole right to repair movement even. I mean, the notion that you buy something and then by just wanting to fix it yourself, suddenly, it is, you voided the warranty. You have now a $1,000 piece of junk because the companies have prevented you from actually working on your own product.
And it's worse than that because, the companies use this law, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, to punish people who make the tools that you might use to repair your own devices. If you swap a donor screen from an iPhone 10 into an iPhone, so you have a machine, an iPhone that's toast, you take its screen, you put it on an iPhone, it doesn't switch on until you get an activation code from Apple. And making a tool that lets you bypass that activation code is a felony, punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. And Apple in coalition with a bunch of big ag companies and other manufacturers, led the charge to kill right to repair legislation in 30 states last year, because it's really important to them that they be able to decide when a phone is repairable or not. They had an earnings call at the start of this year where they said, our biggest risk to our long-term profits is our users not replacing their phones as often as they used to. And if you can control repair, you can control when a device is retired from the stream of commerce. And at the same time, recycling a ton of e-waste creates 15 low-wage jobs. Repairing a ton of e-waste creates 200 high-waged local jobs, right? People don't send their phones to India or China to get them fixed. They take them to the guy in the corner.
Right.
And so, right to repair is obviously beneficial. And it strikes right to the core of what it means to even own property. Because if you own something, then you should get to decide who fixes it, right? It's even if the manufacturer would disprefer it, there's no such thing as felony contempt of business model,
right?
They sold it to you. If they didn't want you to fix it, they should have not put it in the stream of commerce, because once we own it, the bargain is we get to decide what to do with it.
Well, and this is, let's step forward a bit in the story Radicalized, which the book is named after. This is a revolt over healthcare.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a story about what happens when, traumatized and aggrieved white dudes, instead of shooting their ex-wives or brown people in mosques, start killing the healthcare executives whose bureaucratic decisions have killed the people that are most important to them in the world and doom them to slow, painful deaths. And they end up on message boards where nominally they're for support for people going through this, but they become places in which people's trauma is weaponized to turn them into terrorists. Of course, at first no one wants to call them terrorists, because when a white dude shoots up someone else, it's a lone wolf, not a terrorist. But it turns out that if they're shooting people who are a lot whiter and richer than they are, that the T word comes out pretty quick. And, it's about some of the ambivalence that we have when people are doing things that are morally unjustifiable in the pursuit of a moral cause. Rights are always given, they're never taken. And so every rights struggle involves a spectrum of activity, some of which, in hindsight, we're like, oh, those people were monsters.
Right.
And, in the moment when you're cheering for them because they're your monsters, you have to have a reckoning later where you take account of the fact that you cheered on someone doing something monstrous.
Was there any, as a Canadian, dealing with a healthcare system that isn't quite like what you represented in the book, and it seems like maybe it was, a healthcare system representative of what we have here in the United States. What was the inspiration specifically for this story? Was there a precipitating moment, or was it just sort of an ambient feeling that this is where things are headed?
Well, as you say, as a Canadian, I'm mystified by the blind spots of the other countries I've lived in have had. When I lived in Britain, I just couldn't believe how, obviously the opposite of British was plumbing, right? How can a country that had an empire that spanned the globe not figure out how to get water pressure on the second floor? And living here, I'm baffled by the state of the gun control and the healthcare debate. It's bizarre. But really the thing that got me thinking about this more than anything else was the story of the woman who coined the term incel, involuntary celibates. These are the young men who have become terrorists, right? Who murder people in the name of their trauma about being unloved and being lonely. And they have these sort of elaborate misogynist fantasies, but the origin of
there was a gentleman in L.A., right, who went out into I remember reading about this. Yes,
10 people in a van, just drove it up on the pavement in my hometown. And the woman who coined the term incel, she was a Canadian queer woman who created the first message board for this, and she realized that while the normal support message board is a place where the people who've been there the longest are the people who've figured it out the best, right? If you're coping with alcoholism and you're on a message board, the most established people on that message board are the people who've been sober for a long time. And when you fall off the wagon, they give you good advice. They show you that it gets better. But on the incel message board, everyone who figured it out left. And the only people who were left behind were the most irredeemable, most traumatized, most unlovable.
A distillation of this sort of idea.
And they just made it worse and worse and worse. And that dynamic really struck me as one that I've seen online, where some communities become communities of mutual support, and some communities become communities where people are taught the worst lessons, and it seems like it's kind of a crapshoot which way it goes. But, when we talk about radicalization, we talk about it as though it's like a contagion, right? Like you have a patient zero who is radical, and they run into people who are perfectly fine, and they make those people radical, and then those people go out and do terrible things. When you actually look at, say, suicide bombers in the occupied territories, there's a big Boston University psych case study history of suicide bombers from the occupied territories. They found that the most common predicate or predictor of being a suicide bomber is being suicidal, right? Being so traumatized that you are suicidal, and that makes you vulnerable to being weaponized by people who have radical political ideologies. But when we address radicalization, we never address the trauma. It's like that terrible apology that goes, I'm really sorry you're angry at me.
Right.
Which
is a non-apology.
Which is not an apology. And our response to radicalization is, I'm really sorry you're traumatized. I'm not going to do anything about the trauma, but could you please try to be a little less traumatized by it?
Exactly. So when people read this book and they talk to you about it, what do they get wrong about it? What do they read, and do you feel like you kind of missed the point?
I've been lucky so far. Now, the book's only been out for a few days, but I've been lucky so far. People have been really right on about it. It's sparked the kinds of discussions that I hoped it would. And, I think part of that is by keeping central to the writing project, making sure that they're good stories, right? That they're not just things that plumb important technological and social questions, but that, entertain and move and so on. And I think that telling a good story helps people get past their initial critical or political response to it and lets it really sink in. Like, really, it's like a kind of architectural fly-through of the lived experience of some technological or social phenomenon. And when you're immersed in it in that way, it gets you past your initial bias or your first reaction and really helps you think about it more deeply or come at it with fresh eyes.